My name is Andy Richards. I'm the managing producer, Diversity of Voices for Mosaic. And I think most of you know by now that Mosaic is a new platform whose goal it is to celebrate the diversity of New Jersey. We want to amplify voices that are not normally heard by the media. We want to strengthen bridges across communities and foster meaningful communication like we are in this event today. On behalf of Mosaic, we are pleased to join with the Center for Cooperative Media to present this panel as part of the monthly Not Your Same Old Sources press briefings, which support ethnic and community media by facilitating experts, newsmakers who are government officials and people who can talk about the timely issues that affect our communities. In just a moment, Dr. James Jones, who is the assistant professor at Rutgers University-Newark and director of the university's new Center for Politics and Race in America, will introduce our distinguished panel and lead us through this conversation about issues that are important to Black voters and address some heavy topics such as inflation, housing inequality, education, and voting rights. We'll also touch on other topics that impact Black voter turnout, such as racism, white supremacy, community safety, and police reform. So I hope you all pay careful attention. I think it's going to be a very exciting talk today. And again, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe and Ditas for some reminders about how we'll conduct today's talk.
All right. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that. Just a quick note. This is being recorded. As you saw from the 18,000 pop-up windows, you probably had to click accept when you joined. You'll get a copy of the recording, a rough transcript that's auto-transcribed, and as well as any resources or links or anything that is mentioned or that we feel might be useful, either mentioned in the chat or otherwise. We also, upon agreement from our esteemed guests today, we're hoping to send over any contact information for them or their offices if you want to follow up with them afterwards. Otherwise, just be courteous. We will have time for Q&A at the end. If you have a question, you can post it in the chat, or you can use the wait for the Q&A part, and you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature down below at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll try to make sure that we call on you and get to you in the order in which your question was received. And if not, we'll try to make sure we get to you before the time runs out. We are going to be respectful of your time and try to end right on at the top of the hour here today. But again, we will provide follow-up contact information for the offices or individuals of the offices of the individuals that are on the call today. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on Black voters and the 2024 elections. As we gather here today, I want to acknowledge some of the stark realities faced by Black communities in our state. It's disheartening to note that despite New Jersey's reputation for progressiveness, it stands as the sixth most segregated state in the nation for Black students. This segregation not only perpetuates inequality, but also hampers the prospects of future generations. Statistics on wealth and inequality are equally troubling, with the median net worth of $103,000 for white residents compared to a mere $4,900 for Black residents and $2,300 for Latinx residents. It's evident that systemic barriers continue to hinder economic mobility and prosperity for communities of color. And finally, there are alarming disparity in incarceration rates between Black youth and their white counterparts, with a ratio of 18-1 underscores the deep-rooted inequalities in our criminal justice system. Again, this injustice not only devastates individual lives, but perpetuates cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. So, in light of these sobering realities, our discussion holds immense significance, right? I want to begin our discussion thinking about some of these issues which I've raised, but also thinking about the ways in which we can engage Black voters in upcoming elections. So let me introduce you to our esteemed guests. First, we have Dr. Saladin Ambar, Professor of Political Science and a Senior Scholar at the Center on American Government at Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics. Next, we have Mayor Raz Baraka, Mayor of the state's largest city, Newark, New Jersey, and President of the New Jersey Urban Mayors Association. He is also an Executive Board Member of NJ League of Municipalities and co-chair of the National League of Cities Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. We also have Ashanti Jones, a policy analyst in the Criminal Justice Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. She is also a social worker, speaker, and policy analyst with a specialty in juvenile justice, restorative and transformative justice, and equity practices. And finally, but not least, we are joined by Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumner from the 35th District and chair of the New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus. Welcome, everyone. So I wanted to start with Mayor Baraka. So New Jersey ranks as one of the top 3 states with the highest foreclosure rates. The Rutgers Center on Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity, CLIME, published a report, Who Owns Newark? Transforming Wealth from Newark Homeowners to Corporate Buyers, which showed that there's a sort of national trend in buying 1 to 4 unit homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods. And in particular, this is most acute in Newark, New Jersey, where almost half of all real estate sales were made by institutional buyers. This trend grew out of this foreclosure crisis that wiped out a significant middle-class wealth in Newark neighborhoods, where we sort of see these investors seeking passive returns from rents. What measures have your administration taken to sort of address this and the housing crisis as a whole? And what lessons can we sort of draw from this for the state?
Well, first, I want to correct something. My colleague, Mayor Mapp, is the new president of the Urban Mayors. I just want to correct that for the record, so nobody ain't saying nothing different. But we just transferred power. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, there's some very specific things that we're trying to do, which I think are rafts that we're creating to keep people afloat, trying to create opportunity for low-income and affordable housing here in the city of Newark. While this is happening, obviously we can't create it as fast as this wave is coming, which means we need other help. We need support from our state partners, from our federal partners as well, to make sure we can move more rapidly on this. What we have done, we already had inclusionary zoning. We strengthened it, obviously, to make it more stringent, to make it more difficult for you to not build affordable housing on the property that you built. We changed our zoning laws to create more opportunity for density and for moderate and small developers to be able to develop more affordability throughout the city. But more importantly, we created a group of people. We put small minority developers, Black and brown developers, women developers together with local nonprofits. We put them together. We passed an ordinance, thanks to the municipal council, that gave the first right of refusal to city-owned property to local nonprofit developers, to get them to begin to chart out properties in the city and buy it and develop it first. The city is also on the hook we've created a fund, an acquisition fund that would help these developers acquire more property. I mean, because the best way to go at this is to go out in the market and get the properties ourselves, to accumulate these properties and begin to get small, mid-sized developers along with nonprofits to do this kind of development for us. We've also, as been as creative as possible, to create home ownership in the city through our Section 8 voucher program and through the program where we've expanded it to people that at least 40, 50, 60% of the AMI can begin to, purchase homes in our city with no down payment, which is usually the barrier for us. No down payment, nothing at the closing, so they can just walk right in with the keys. And of course, they go through all kinds of training and stuff before that. But we're trying to be as creative as possible to deal with this. But it would be disingenuous for me to say that those things that we put together is going to handle this problem in and of itself, right? These are things that we've created collectively to try to keep people afloat, to protect them from an avalanche of capital that has ravaged the city and these communities purposefully and very deliberately, to kind of further making money off of communities that are desperately seeking help. So we're doing what we can in the city. And like I said in the beginning, we obviously need state and federal assistance on this. And everybody in the state of New Jersey has to be a part of building affordable housing in the city. I mean, every single person, entity, group, not just affordable housing, but diversity of housing in the city is getting so bad that people who make about $200,000 are renting because they can't even afford mortgages here in the city, here in the state of New Jersey. So it's important for us to take housing as very, very, very seriously as I do. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to turn to Assemblywoman Sumter. So last year, you launched your podcast, There's Sumter to Talk About, centering on wellness and mental health with a particular emphasis on communities of colors. Can you share what inspired you to sort of address this issue, but also on this platform, right, on a podcast, elaborate why mental health is a critical concern for facing the Black community?
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for that. And thank you for this space with this incredible panel. All the topics that we're addressing are those that are typically not talked about publicly, but in our small sections of the kitchen and cohorts. I can tell you I've worked closely with just about everyone here on this panel, let alone Rutgers, to collate the data. And for me, when we don't talk about mental health, we're not talking about health and wellness. The pandemic exacerbated people's mental health, not being able to continue with life as the way they knew it, not sure of what tomorrow would bring, and suffering from grief at a magnitude never experienced by our generation. So I had to talk about it. It was a challenge. And again, it started with me doing morning walks and just taking my iPhone out and recording what I was doing and what I was seeing in my own neighborhood, waving to folks because we couldn't touch. And for our community as Black people, touching, right, and being able to be in each other's physical space is critical. But not only that, we don't talk about what professional mental health and having access to it means. So I am a strong advocate for being sure that we have access to professionals and that reimbursements and funds are there. Being in the state for the first time last year, we appropriated upwards of $120 million into our mental health system. We also sustained, which came out of the pandemic, because prior to the pandemic, virtual therapy sessions did not exist and were not paid for at the same rate as an in-person office visit. We then learned that our youth were suffering at record numbers from mental health and not being able to call it mental health or a formal diagnosis, but saying, hey, I feel sadness. I feel an emptiness and a loneliness because I'm not with my peers in a classroom. I'm in this bubble with my family and I can't go outside and play and have a routine that I once had. And it was a generation impact. So coming out of that pandemic, I knew, especially in the Black diaspora, that we needed a safe space to talk about it. I leaned on some of my friends who are professionals, not only African Americans, but also Latin Americans who had the skill to talk about what we could do with music, dance, culture, writing, to really infuse that in a podcast format that was non-threatening. None of us ever did it before. And we really treated it like our living room where we would have these conversations in an open and honest way. I am proud to say also that we infuse cash in the school-based mental health system. Again, teachers are teachers. They were also suffering from mental illness and depression and loneliness and being confined and having to take care of their own families while still trying to teach remote, not having access to broadband. All of these issues were intersecting at a high speed, drinking water through a fire hydrant. And we as elected officials had to give more of ourselves than just saying, I hear you, I'm going to put pen to paper and we'll get to a policy change. No, this required us to give more of ourselves, add voice to the experience, and call out and say, it's okay. New legislation that I have coming up is loneliness as an epidemic, which our Surgeon General has also reported, that impacts all ages. So it's important to me. It is important to me that we continue to amplify what mental health means in our community and put funding towards it as we combat these very serious and high-level issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ashanti, so criminal justice reform is a key concern for many Black voters in New Jersey. right? So research from your own New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, as I noted earlier, indicates that for every 18 Black youth incarcerated, 18 youth, excuse me, for every white youth incarcerated in New Jersey, there are 18 Black youth incarcerated. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the criminal justice system operates in New Jersey, and I guess some of its nuances and how it is disproportionately punishing Black youth and what we can do about it?
Sure. So before I begin, I just want to reiterate the thanks that some of my fellow panelists have shared for hosting this space. It's really good to be here to discuss these issues. But I think the first is we have to recognize that those are last year's numbers, okay? 18-1 were last year's numbers. This year's numbers are 29-1. So for every one white child who's incarcerated here in New Jersey, we have 29 Black children who are subject to incarceration here. And I mean, we incarcerate these youth at a cost of about $531,000 per youth. And so given these racial disparities in those numbers, this presents, as a specific investment in incarcerating Black youth. I mean, it's a lot of money for a system that just doesn't work, especially given our recidivism rates. And, we've made some progress with like JDAI. We're the only state in the country who has JDAI statewide, which is really great on paper, right? But it is actually not doing much for our diversion here in New Jersey, given the fact that our racial disparities are actually getting progressively worse. Our juvenile justice population is diminishing, but one, we're still funding these facilities as if they're still full, and we're also still incarcerating Black kids at disproportionate rates. And I mean, we have, the juvenile justice system is really broad and wide, right? It starts as early as a police stop, right? And all the way through to post-release monitoring, right? And so there are, opportunities for diversion at the front end, right? There have been station house adjustments that have been given from the Attorney General's office, directives that are not necessarily codified, so they're merely like suggestions, right? And so without having something in place that mandates that, station house adjustments have to happen, on the front end for those who are eligible for them, it's left up to the discretion of the officer. And when you leave discretion to the table, you also leave room for bias, right? And systemic racism, right? And so I think that there are definitely ways that we can fix that. And I mean, it's also about the fact that, criminal justice contact in New Jersey has significant disparities from juvenile all the way through adult incarceration, because we also have the worst racial disparity rate in the nation for adults as well, right? With 12-1. And most of the science supports the fact that juvenile incarceration predates adult incarceration. So a lot of those young people who have that initial contact with the system will eventually touch it again. And we also have an older juvenile justice population, right? It's not necessarily 12 and 13-year-olds who are out here being subject to incarceration, but really some of those older young people who spend a lot of time within the system. And so, New Jersey has had a lot of opportunities, to address some of these issues. I mean, we've done some things like trying to scale down juvenile incarceration by the institution of JDAI, by figuring out how we can build up restorative practices. So we had the restorative and transformative justice hubs, the one in Newark that just opened up last week, right? We're really excited about what that program means for diverting young people away from the system, and also keeping them out once they're out, right? And so we've done some things like that, but there's a lot more to do, right? And especially when it comes to the initial touching of the system. And so I just want to talk a little bit about like the police stops, right? And so like New Jersey also has a 5-1 Black to white racial disparity in police stops, right? And that's kind of where it starts, and since 2020, we had the murder of George Floyd, right? Which preempted a bunch of reforms, not only here in New Jersey, but across the nation. But New Jersey has had many opportunities to pass good legislation, and it just hasn't, right? So like we missed the opportunity to pass chokehold bans, right? CCRBs, right? And I mean, we need more community-based policing alternatives, right? People that he can meet people where they are in the community and offer them some of those alternatives. And we also need additional insight into scaling down our juvenile justice incarceration and investing in community-based alternatives. And the restorative justice programs were just a start, right? Having some of those, I believe what passed in the last session gave money for some of those non-police first responder programs. Like those are really great as well. And I think that those are some of the things that we're doing to kind of, reduce those touches. And I mean, we have the consent decree, right? We have the bias audits. And so we're doing some of the work. It's just not moving as quickly, as we'd like.
So I want to be mindful of our time, and I do want to leave time to open up for questions. So I wanted to switch the panel just a little bit. I'm talking about the issues that are confronting Black voters to talking about Black voters in New Jersey themselves as a group, right? A diverse group. So my question first is for Dr. Ambar, and then we can sort of open it up to the rest of the panel as we sort of talk about the state of Black voters in New Jersey. But Dr. Ambar, as we sort of heard from each panelist, there are so many different issues confronting Black voters. And this could be a panel or a series of panels where we really dig into all of these issues. But I'm thinking about how do we engage Black voters, right? In order to, drive policy change, to have representative elected officials. So just a few statistics, right? So thinking about Black voter turnout. So between 2018 and 2020 midterms, there was an 8% in Black voter turnout, an 8% dip in Black voter turnout. The 2021 New Jersey gubernatorial election was one of the lowest in the past century for governor's race at 40%. And we sort of see this shift in political alignment amongst Black voters where I think particularly driven by young voters, there's a lot of disenchantment with the Democratic Party. What do we need to do to drive Black voter turnout up? Is this a question of enthusiasm, or is this a question about disenfranchisement, right? And the barriers that Black voters are fronting to vote?
It's an important question, James, and thank you for asking it. Look, I hate to put this in some historical context, but look at this Generation Z and maybe some younger millennials. What has their life experience taught them? It's taught them that we could not prevent a 9/11. We could not do anything to help the citizens of New Orleans during Katrina. We could not prevent a Great Recession. We were told there were weapons of mass destruction. There weren't. We were told that we have unlimited resources to fund Ukraine or Israel, the Department of Defense, but we can't help you with water. We can't help you with infrastructure. We can't help you with schools. What they've seen and what we have seen, frankly, is a significant shift from the 60s and 70s over the last 40 years towards a kind of politics that rewards the upper class, the 1%, and rejects working folks. I mean, I hate to just put it in those terms, but that's what it is. And how do you engage people who are disengaged? Well, the first thing is to not insult them. And I think a lot of times when I'm on social media and I look at people responding to students or younger voters or disaffected Black voters, oftentimes they'll say, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to vote for Trump or, get your act together? There's this kind of assault on their logic and frankly, fundamental decency, because there's a level of disaffection there. So first and foremost, you've got to address the crisis of disaffection where people are. People are not insane. People see that their fundamental needs are oftentimes not being met. Secondarily to that, I think we've got to look at the specific issues, whether it's education. I've taught half my career in the public schools, 10 years in Princeton High School. You would think that's a very elite institution and successful, and it is. But the experience of Black and brown students at a place even like Princeton is radically different than white students. Even at Rutgers, where I teach honor students, people who are opposed to DEI will tell you that it's just running amok, I imagine, with Black and brown students and faces in every classroom. But I have far too few African-American students in my presidency class, far too few in my American political thought class. Where are all of these, overrun courses filled with Black and brown faces? It's really quite a myth. We have to do a better job of confirming and affirming people's realities. Their experiences are not hallucinations. People are really experiencing these things, and we have to first and foremost address them. That's just a shorthand, and I don't mean to be glib, so pardon me if I'm coming off as glib. I don't mean to be glib about it, but that's just a shorthand beginning to thinking about these problems, not pushing people away and insulting them by saying somehow they have no other choice but to vote Democratic or no other choice but to, get with whatever program any given politician is articulating. You've got to really appreciate what people are experiencing on the ground.
Thank you. And I am grappling with this a lot with my students, right? Young students who have lost faith in American institutions across levels. So one of the things that, strikes me as a professor, I'm challenged to do is like, how do you keep the faith, right? And I think one of the questions I have, it came up with Assemblywoman Sumner's work, which I think was so important on mental health, is, again, thinking about how do we communicate to Black voters, right? How do you talk about progress? All right, so if I can get a little bit wonky, right? And political science, there is this concept of like the submerged state, which we don't see how government is actually working, right? Like we just see the bad parts, right? And so if we could highlight an instance of this working in the opposite, we would see President Trump branding himself, his name on the stimulus checks, right? So we know we can associate that with the president, right? But that is very much like the opposite, right? We don't see good government working. So how do we, I guess this question is for Mayor Baraka and Assemblywoman Sumner, how do you communicate the progress that you guys are doing in City Hall, in the state legislature, but also at the same time, recognizing the realities that Dr. Ambar sort of talked about? It was like, hey, stuff is not great, but we are doing something.
Well, I mean, I think what Dr. Ambar said is right on the money, by the way. That is it. He hit the nail on the head in my estimation, particularly in government, especially Black leaders who young people are not really associated with the kind of civil rights struggle that it took place. There's no more first Black mayors, right? So at this point, we've been at it for some time. And we've not been able to explain to them the kind of systemic issues that create these problems. We try to wear it ourselves. And so what happens is people begin to say, you're the problem and not the system itself, or make those associations. And we have not done a good job at pushing that out and making it clear for young people exactly what's going on here, not just in your city, but what are the national trends that are happening that is affecting your life, and how do you get involved in it to help change those things? Clearly, I also think that a lot of people who are doing good are just doing good. They're not really trying to market what it is that they're doing. They're here, like if I look at folks in City Hall who are doing the work that they're doing, these guys are not careerists. Like they're in there doing real work and praying that, something happens as a result of the work that they do, making mistakes and getting back up and doing it again because they're committed to it. But there's nobody like pushing that out all the time. And we just have to get better at that. And sometimes we rely on the press to do that for us. And that's not really their job, or, they're just not committed to making that happen. Ultimately, everybody has to sell papers. They're in competition with what's going on social media, trying to put this out, put that out. So a lot of things get missed, right? A lot of stuff get missed, like real work that's happening gets missed. And so it also creates an environment of hopelessness. Young people feeling like what was said, look, we did all of this. We voted, we participated, you did this. We still living in poverty. We still have segregation in our schools. We're still being murdered on the street. All of these things are happening. How do we get a windfall here? Like, what do we need to do to get a windfall? And if we're sending them the message that money is the answer, then of course, Black men, especially who kind of believe that they have been, looked over in a system of male dominance, who are trying to buy into that system, believe ultimately like the way for them to win is to do what white dominant males are doing, right? And so that makes them feel like they should be with people like Trump, who seem to be successful in their eyes in getting things done. Meanwhile, you keep talking about civil rights, and we over here struggling, B. Like, what are we going to do to fix these problems right now? And those are like real messages and real conversations that I have with young people in my city, in schools, those are formerly incarcerated, guys on the street, the men's meet, and so forth and so on. Real conversation about how do I get engaged and involved? How do I take care of my family? Like, how do I fit this definition of what man is supposed to be in America? And it's disheartening at times, but you're right. We have to do a better job at marketing and putting out and branding the work that we do every single day, so young people can see that there are some dividends if you do right and do good and put your head down and dig in.
To each of you, and the mayor knows how I feel in regards to how do we keep people engaged. The first point is to keep talking, right? We cannot grow tired of talking and self-promoting. Black media, we don't have enough of it to get our message out. So this panel right here today, Mosaic, I was excited about, because even if you watched the U.S. Senate debate last night, Rider University, the Globe, there were no Black questionnaires that were on that panel. And if we're the part of delivering for the Democratic Party, that's a problem. Some success. The Institute of Social Justice was a partner in the mayor in this, restoring the right to vote for persons on probation and parole. Hit us since 1844. Maternal health as a public health crisis. That was Black women in the legislature who held the first hearing, and First Lady Tammy Murphy was there. Legislation passed to be sure that we fund postpartum care, Black women in the legislature. When we talk about reparative and restorative justice, putting money into harm reduction centers, that was members of the Black Caucus. Now, there's no vehicle for me being a member of a 120 body system to say Shavonda Sumter did this, because I have to do it with 41 votes in the Assembly, 21 votes in the Senate, and then you got the Speaker, the Senate President, and the Governor, who has a bigger microphone and bigger access to media. So our job is to continue to run the race. Now, it does become exhausting because there's so many battles we must fight. We heard about affordable housing here. We heard about mental health. We heard about the juvenile justice system. We heard about higher ed. And all of them need work because it's systemic structural barriers and racism baked within them. And what we have to do is stay encouraged. Now, when we talk about young people and voting, the city of Newark went first in putting a resolution in place where 16-year-olds can vote in school board elections, led by students. And then the state followed suit. So we can practice to make perfect. New Jersey has an election in May, June, and November. We expanded the right to vote. We did early registration. You don't have to wait online and early voting. So those are the things legally that we can put in place, but building trust in that system. And then, of course, what I have to share with voters is, hey, if you don't vote, I don't win, and I can't do what I need to do for you. And it may not be everything, right? Because power's not given, it's taken, but we got to stay at the table and lean in and keep fighting. Listen, when we talk about school segregation, this is another iteration of a fight that we've been having for decades as a youth in NAACP. That's based on zip codes. When we talk about access to affordable housing, it's not just for Black people. It's for the disabled, right? It's for seniors. It's for veterans. And now when you talk about people who exceed that median income, not having enough housing stock and embedding wars just for a little piece of what's called the American dream, to own a little piece of your own property for security, let alone wealth building. The disparity study, which I hope we get to, 20 plus years in the making to have done, so we can do set aside programs that showed less than 1% of procurement contracts, service goods, construction went to Black people, less than 1%. Out of state, people got more contracts than Black people in state. And we have professionals in the local geographic region that were eligible. systemic and structural. So with all that said, and I get a little passionate, but we can't get tired, and we have to raise up a generation. I'm only the second African-American woman in 221 sessions to serve my district. I'm number 2. So I got to leave that door open, and I got to coach and teach and encourage and keep the faith and hope as I run this race. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Sumner. So I want to give a shameless plug, but also a thank you to Assemblywoman for supporting the Center for Politics and Race. One of the things that we're going to be doing is we are trying to diversify who gets to participate in politics and public service. But I think one of the things that you've raised, and it's been raised in this conversation, is that, that means also strengthening our the press and Black press and ethnic media. So we're going to be providing stipends for our students to go work in ethnic media outlets. So if there are anyone listening, please reach out to us and we will get you a paid Rutgers Newark student for the summer or a fall semester or spring semester. I wanted to sort of open up for questions, but I wanted to sort of maybe go to Ashanti for one last question for the panel. I think, I don't want to reduce Black voters to a monolith, right? So I wonder if you could sort of talk to us about some of the differences that you see and the interests of Black voters, and also thinking about how that might, recognizing these differences might spur engagement as well.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. I wanted to sort of talk about some of the nuances of Black voters in New Jersey. I think there's obviously some generational differences, but just recognizing this diversity within amongst Black voters, I just want to sort of recognize, that we all don't think alike, where you have different as well.
Yeah, I think when you look at some of the key issues that are faced by people of color and, other New Jerseyans, it's not really a zero-sum game, right? It's like a false division. So as human beings living in our state, Black people and other people of color, we're impacted by inflation, immigration, right? All the same issues that everyone else is, and so I think that obviously we experience these things on a spectrum, right? Because again, it's similar to what Assemblywoman Sumter was saying, she's only the second Black person representing in her district, right? And so I think that we all have those same kind of divisions where we live, right? We may be the first generation student, right? You may be the first person in your family to vote, right? And I was thinking about that as we're thinking about keeping people engaged. You have to think about before we were able to restore the right to vote, to those New Jerseyans, there were a group of people who probably never seen their parents vote. Right. And so democracy doesn't necessarily show up on their doorsteps in the same way that it may for someone who does have family who may be, in the political atmosphere. There may be some who care more about higher education issues, right, because they may be a first generation student or things like that. But I think you're right. We are not a monolith. And so we care about very different things, while some may be more focused on home ownership. Others are focused more on, criminal justice reform. And I mean, that's kind of how I got here, right? For really realizing how the criminal justice system impacted my family and the way that my life went. That's kind of the issue that I care about. And I think that we're not necessarily absolved from caring about all things, right? From maternal health to immigration to policing to segregation in our schools, all of these things have some sort of impact on our life course. And so I think that while we may not all care about them to the same degree, we care about them to some degree.
Thank you. So I'll encourage our guests to put your questions in the chat and we can ask our panelists. I do want to end with one final question for the panel. Given that, our audience is mostly reporters in the state, I wanted to ask you, what critical issues, critical Black issues do you believe are being overlooked in the media? Alternatively, another way of putting this, what stories about Black voters do you believe journalists should be prioritizing covering right now?
Can I start? So at risk of being cliche, all of them, right? I think right now we have a lot of colorblind media, colorblind politics in the media. And it's really important to move away from that because we need to have a real conversation and real conversations in the media about the history of racism in our state. You know, we seem very progressive, like on the national stage, and maybe even to the world in some aspects, but we really avoid the difficult conversations about the reality that we face here. And a lot of that is just not presented in the media in a way. Like last night, we had an entire debate between our Senate representatives where Black people weren't mentioned. That's a problem, right? And so it's like, you know, we opened up, like, for example, like in our state, we opened up youth prisons after emancipation and the passage of the 13th Amendment, right? And today we have the worst racial disparities in the country in those same prisons. That's not something that happened in a vacuum, right? It is something that was able to persist because people weren't paying attention to it, not in the ways that they should have. You know, we have formerly red line communities here that are still structured in the same way, right? You know, intentional Black education in our state was resolved in 1955 in the name of integration, yet we still have those significant segregation in our school, right? Like we don't have authentic conversations about equity in our state. And so like if we continue to ignore that race is still deeply embedded in the fabric of New Jersey, we're not doing anyone any favors. Not in politics, you're not going to get people engaged. And, you know, media will continue to ignore it. So I think that we have to provide more platforms like this one, right, where people are actually coming to hear about what the issues are. Exactly what is it about education that Black people care about? What exactly about housing do people care about? What exactly it is about higher education? What are those barriers? Because I think when we talk about them very broadly and don't really like hone into what some of those systemic issues are, we miss the mark.
So, and to Ashanti's point, and also being able to look at the chat for our journalists, legitimate voices, print our editorials that share perspective, because it's not expected that you will always have the perspective, but ask us to be ghost writers, or excuse me, guest writers on these different issues that are critical, because it's not just the data, but it's what's the impact of the data? What's the systemic structure impact behind the data? And give us those platforms to really participate and lend a voice to some of the challenges, because how you say also matters, and our communities proper. For the Black Caucus, we have 19 members, and we hail from Cape May County all the way to Hudson County. Rural, suburban, urban, but all have similar issues. Harriet Tubman Museum is down in Cape May. She started there, but yet Newark also has a beautiful exhibit in the park right across from the library for Harriet Tubman. Give us those spaces to really highlight not only just when there's a shooting and you want to highlight the violence, but let's talk about the reparative justice that needs to be partnered with that, because the trauma lives on and how we move through those pieces. Let's highlight some of our talented young youth scholars. Back when they used to highlight those pieces in the paper, and now we've moved to an online function, but we're more than just sports, right? So the mayor is also a poet, right? So give us those spaces, and Dr. Ambar and Dr. Jones, even hearing your voices for our young Black men to see you to hear that you are teaching in higher education, critical. Our kids reminded us, my son's 24, my daughter's 25. We opted to send them to private school, Christian-based education, but they didn't have Black teachers. And that was a deficit that impact and was an impression on their lives, and it wasn't our intent. So again, having exposure and being a part of the mainstream media to see you all, just like folks need to see us in these spaces, it all matters.
Well, I think that these ladies said everything, honestly. There's probably nothing else to be said about that. It's very, very clear and robust about what should happen. I think it lies in people's intention and what their overall objective is. You know, we hide under the idea that we're just trying to be balanced in our, you know, media or reporting. And really, we find at the end of it, we wind up being unbalanced because, you know, there is equality is not equity, right? And so at the end of the day, it is important for people to have context. And we don't provide context. And I think a lot of the smaller kind of, you know, news agencies and the blogs and so forth and so on. We need you to actually help provide that context, because a lot of these people are not doing it. But we need that, right? And I think this thing that NJ.com is, Mosaic, I think is a great way to begin that process, right? To provide the kind of context that needs to happen. Like, but somebody will make a report, what you said, that, these giant LLCs are coming in, buying property in the city of Newark without any context, without any deeper understanding. So what it appears like is that we're finding huge conglomerates and selling property to them on the side of the road or something, and not there's a systemic effort to do this nationally. And for what? What's the benefit out of it? And I think when people have context, then they have understanding. When they have understanding, they can make conclusions on their own instead of us trying to make conclusions for them. Our folks are smart enough to conclude on their own what's happening out here. They don't need you to add to that, to provide the kind of context that's necessary for people to make fair and just conclusions.
Okay, so I have a question for Assemblywoman Sumner and also for the panel. You mentioned infrastructure as an issue. Can you or anyone on the panel elaborate on how this manifests as an issue for Black voters?
Sure. And I just typed a response in the chat. Inclusive housing and development with Black developers. It's not enough to just say, which is what the mayor was just impressing upon, that you have development happening, but do the developers look like us? In Patterson, Hinchcliffe Stadium was being punted around for over 20 years between the school district and between the city. My husband got a band scholarship to a HBCU because they saw him playing on that field, drum major at Eastside High School. The National Negro League played baseball there. We're the second stadium that's still remaining. Baye Adolfo Wilson, who also worked with the mayor, came back home because Patterson's home to him, and we talked extensively to renovate that stadium. Architect, lawyer, engineer. And he was committed and doubled down. And it was important for our young people to see that, again, we can develop and we can rehab our own communities with state tax credits, as well as federal tax credits and municipal tax credits and county tax credits. This was all of government working together to rehab a stadium as a crown jewel, part of a national park that President Obama designated. And we see people from all over the country traveling to this area. That's investments, repairing our schools. We have some of the oldest schools in the country, let alone in our urban centers. They should be learning environments that children look forward to going to, as well as our educators. And they have the tools that they need, broadband access, that's infrastructure. Federal government put money in the street for infrastructure development. We know we also have some of the oldest bridges in the country. It's being sure that we're going back to work. How do you get out of a depression, recession? It's people working. And it's dollars coming at a greater level from the federal government to support that. But we also need to be sure that minorities are on those projects. So that's the work that I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question about Black voter turnout. Perhaps Dr. Ambar, you can help answer this if you can. It's essentially about how Black voter turnout was during the Obama presidency. So, and again, this is for Dr. Ambar, I'm assuming, as a political science, maybe you can answer this for us. How is Black voter turnout, what has that looked like over the last 15 years? And over the last 15 years, I would say. Sure.
Well, certainly during the Obama campaigns of 08 and in 12, we saw historic increases in New Jersey and across the country in Black participation. And I think that the reason is obvious. It was a historic education. People were taking their children or grandchildren to the polls with them. But there was also in the aftermath and even during the Obama years for some, I think it's fair to say, some disappointment. I think when you have great expectations, as Dr. King said, there can be no great disappointment where there's not great love. And I think there was a great love and anticipation that there'd be perhaps a transformational turn in our politics and national priorities with the Obama presidency. And what we've seen is that really hasn't been the case. And I think looking at the administration of President Biden and frankly, the Democratic Party, there's, always been great Black support for both President Biden, but also for the Democratic Party writ large. But that support has not translated into meaningful equality and pragmatic gains on the ground for enough Black voters to feel as though they are empowered and that their vote has fully counted. I think that challenge, probably exacerbated by the COVID years, in a sense that the system has sort of languished as they have languished, has led to a real disaffection. I think, back to New Jersey very quickly, I want to highlight the question of affordable housing and policing. Nothing alienates you. Certainly it's true for Black voters, but anybody. I don't care if you're talking about the Czech Republic in the 1950s, and nothing alienates you like if you can't afford to live wherever you'd like in your own country, or you feel like you can't pick up the phone and call law enforcement. You are a second-class citizen. At least you feel that way. And I think that those two issues, affordable housing, particularly in a place like New Jersey, which has tremendous wealth inequality, but lots of income, and policing remains still an issue. Not that there haven't been gains. We've seen those gains in Newark and a reduction in shootings, but by and large, there's still a tremendous fear and apprehension in the state about the nature of policing. I would highlight those two issues, and we haven't seen, a John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We haven't seen a George Floyd Act, if you will, or Breonna Taylor Act, to really address some of these fundamental concerns. And until we see those prioritized by the Democratic Party or others, we're going to be seeing, perhaps increasing declines because young voters are less connected to the party. The Barack Obama's term in office, this is kind of starting to become a long time ago now. For my college students, they don't really remember the Obama years, elementary school students don't remember those years. And so what we're seeing now is a kind of ahistorical or loss of historical memory about certainly the civil rights movement. So the nature of connection to those struggles is different now than it was, dare I say, when I was coming up, and perhaps some of the panelists as well.
Yeah. Perhaps for Ashanti, we have a question in the chat that's asking about the relationship between high incarceration incarceration rates and how that shapes the Black voter population. Does that explain lower turnout, or is it something else that's happening here?
Well, I think it's really go ahead. No, you can go. I'll go after you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's more to do with Black people being in jail, but I think it's about the disenfranchisement. So like when you think about like how many thousands of people got the right back to vote who are on probation and parole, right? Many of those men who are in their 50s were voting for the first time. So like you have to think about stuff like that. And then we also have to think about like full restoration is not a thing, right? So you still have many of those Black people who are still incarcerated, who don't have access to vote. And then if you haven't been voting for all of your life and you're kind of set in your ways and you come out and you're like, I can vote now, okay, but like it doesn't mean anything to you. You haven't been having access to that. And obviously of those people who are, not able to vote, they're also not able to serve on a jury, right? And so like when you have disenfranchised people from democracy, because that's what it is, they don't have any, where is my internal motivation to want to participate in democracy? And so I think that's really what it is. And again, like a lot of people, it's not just, there's a saying that like, if I go to jail, it's not just me, my family's going with me. And I think it alludes to the point that I made earlier that men and women are spending how many years in jail, have never voted, their children have never seen them vote, they have no interest in this, right? And so I think that kind of explains why a piece of it, why there may be, a lack of participation in democracy, because we've been excluded from it for so long.
Mayor, do you want to add something?
Yep. I want to say, like, even what Assemblywoman Shamta put in the chat, the 80,000 people who had their voting rights restored. When we were a part of that, that wasn't really a story. Like that wasn't really something that's talked about. So there's probably people in that number who don't even know, right? That this is a thing, that this is a reality. Like that wasn't reported widely because it's not important to folks. And that really is at the crux of it, right? And I would agree that disenfranchisement as a whole, and in New Jersey, for example, not just the country. So at the end of the day, we can't get a CCRB here, right? We're having trouble getting votes around housing issues, around issues. I mean, Brittany Timberlake had a rough time trying to get this thing passed around foreclosure. The issues that we're talking about, like the whole segregation piece, is a problem. Building housing is a problem in New Jersey. So, and those things disproportionately affect us, but those are statewide issues that affect everybody. But it's heavy on our shoulders, right? And so we speak about it more. And based on a comment that was made here, like a lot of folks get turned off when you talk about racial stuff now, because even the Democratic Party, especially in New Jersey, has made this idea that identity politics is a problem. But the only people that have problem with identity politics are people who've never had that identity in question. And so at the end of the day, like, we're trying our best to stay away from that when we should be pushing it, right? We should be unafraid with the things that we're talking about and putting out there. And I think that we need the kind of courageous writing that we just don't see anymore.
So I want to go to this one final question posed by Eric Conklin in the chat. He writes, as a reporter, I perceive that journalism on racial issues often becomes a turnoff for people because they are trying to turn away from politics. Does the panel have any suggestions on how, as a reporter, my work does not get put onto readers' party lines? So I think this is a question about how do we talk about racial issues, but oftentimes, how it's going to get turned off. If I could just answer this or give one answer, it is to expand the ways in which we talk about these issues, and they don't just necessarily harm communities of color, but they harm whites too. One of the instances came to mind was during the pandemic. I was, we had a furlough. I was applying for unemployment for that one day. I was getting furloughed, and the system sucked. It's horrible. You have to sort of correlate this with the last 4 digits of your social security number at a certain time of the day of the week. It's horrible because we think the system is only designed for poor Blacks and poor people of color. So we don't invest in these systems. But when everyone needs it during the pandemic, it fails us, right? So again, racism just doesn't harm communities of color. It is punishing and killing whites too. But I would open up to the rest of the panel to sort of see how can we talk about racial issues in a climate where it's so alienating and people are just, sometimes they have the inclination to go past that article.
So Doc, I think saying it's racial issues is one thing, and of course needs to be said, but humanitarianism, right? How we care about those who are vulnerable, right? And how do we put the issues out there of need that people have? We had no problem talking about the opioid epidemic when it was impacting other communities that were non-minority. But when it was a crack cocaine epidemic, it was 3 strikes you're in, throw away the key, systemic overuse of enforcements. Many doctors did not get arrested for over-prescribing. Pulitzers and journalistic awards were received for reporting on the opioid epidemic, and I remember that clearly. It was a humanizing of abuse of a substance that has harmed the country in more ways than any other substance, but was legal. when we talk about cannabis now, and we didn't even touch on that, so I do think you need to have us back because that's also where we're seeing monies coming in, expecting $1 billion in revenue this year. And how is it hitting the communities most harmed or touching financially? And we haven't even gotten there yet. So I do think that there are reporting options that may not be as headline grabbing, but I do think that when you humanize issues, it will get the attention of your readers.
Can I speak on that? I agree with that. And somebody else put something in the chat that's important, that most of the things that people report on are racial, and it's just not explicit, right? So the audiences you're talking to, the subject matter that you're dealing with, how you approach it and how you present it is a product of who you are, what you believe and what you think. So it emanates on the page and out of the page. So when somebody reads it, they see that, right? And that's important for us to understand, that there's no way to hide that, right? Particularly if you grew up and are educated in a society that, makes that prominent, and so it's difficult to talk about specific things without saying race. So when I read it, I read that. You might not have put it in there, but I read that. I read that this is discriminatory. I read that you're leaving me out. I read that it's exclusionary. I read all of those things, right? And so when we talk about housing and this whole fight around affordable housing and the way it's presented in New Jersey, it's all about race. People understand that. We know that. Like when you're talking about it in our community, we feel like, oh, you just don't want us to live in your neighborhood. That's really what it appears as, right? When we talk about education and the things that are happening, you think our kids, when they go play football in other communities, they don't see that those schools are segregated? They don't see that those places are all white? I mean, it's ridiculous to pretend that you're avoiding that. Like, to write about that is more important than to pretend that it doesn't exist. These kids know it's real. Their mothers know it's real. And the problem is when they come back to school, they think they're the problem, right? And so it's important for us to discuss that and talk about it.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a great discussion, and I think there definitely needs to be a part 2. I want to toss it over to Cassandra Etienne to give some final remarks.
Okay, so I guess we'll leave it here. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cassandra Etienne, Assistant Director at the Center for Cooperative Media. On behalf of Mosaic and everyone here at the Center, we appreciate your taking the time to join us this afternoon to talk about Black voters in the 2024 elections. Special thanks to our wonderful host, Dr. James Jones, our awesome panel, Mayor Rasbaraka, Dr. Ambar, Ashanti Jones, and Assemblywoman Sumter. Please look out for some materials we'll be sending you after today's event with a list of experts on this subject from the Diverse Sources database. It is a publicly available sortable list of experts of different races, ages, genders, and ethnicities in our effort to support local media and to get journalists to diversify their Rolodexes. So look out for that follow-up email with some additional materials from today's event, including the transcript and the video recording. Thanks again, everyone, and until next time, take care and have a great rest of your afternoon.